This is part 9 in the Craftsman 150 drill press rebuild series. If you haven't seen part 8, click the link at the top of the screen now. In this video, we're going to be continuing to work on the motor. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff, and welcome to my shop. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. In part 8, we had disassembled the motor and put most of the parts in simple green for a 24-hour bath. It's now been 24 hours and we're removing them from the bath. Those are the end frames or end bells. That was the air cone. That's one of the pulleys. That is the condenser shield or capacitor shield. That's another pulley and a through bolt. That's the mesh strainer with a bunch of the small parts. That's the armature. So all these parts will get rinsed in cold water, and the parts that had paint on them will get wire brushed with a hand wire brush. And all we're doing is just getting as much of the simple green off of them as possible. And with the wire brush, we're trying to remove the previous coat of paint. Now, some of these older ones, the older drill presses and motors, the paint they used really adheres to this stuff, so sometimes it's hard to get off of there. Now I'm just removing some of the grime from the shaft on the armature. And one of the end frames or end bells. So once we got all those cleaned up, we came outside and started to mix up some citric acid. So I think I'm going to use like 3 shots of citric acid in this. Yep. And we're just mixing up the cold water with it. So I won't be putting the pulleys in here, but all the other parts that were in the simple green will go in the citric acid. And I've kept the terminal end frame out for now because we need to fabricate the terminal cover. So if you recall, we roughed out a cardboard template. And now I'm just using a piece of plate steel. It's about 3/32 thick. I don't remember what gauge, 24 gauge maybe, 26, not sure. Anyways, you can get the plate steel at Home Depot. So I'm just going to trace it out. And this is my Craftsman 100 series bandsaw that I rebuilt. And I have a worm gear on it. It's a gear that slows down the speed of the blade between the motor and the drive pulley on the saw itself. And I have a metal cutting blade on it, and that's all I use this saw for, is cutting metal. So I'm just going to roughly cut it out. And once we've got it, we go over to my Delta grinder, and we're going to grind it out more, get it closer to the shape. I'm not sure why my grinder wasn't sitting level, but there must have been a piece of scrap steel or something under one of the corners. So once we've got a rough shape, we're going to go over to my 1x42 Craftsman sander. This is an awesome sander, by the way. And finish getting it to the proper shape and size. These sanders were made, they're based off of a bell saw sander, and lots of companies sold them, Delta, Rockwell, everybody, but they're awesome sanders. And once we know we've got a good shape and a good fit, we need to mark where the holes are going to go for the screws. So I'm going through the inside of the end frame with a punch, and I'm just making a indentation on the cover where those screws need to be, screw holes need to be. And then we'll mark them with a Sharpie. And then we're going to use my float lock drill press vise to hold it. And we've got the proper size bit already in the drill. And so we'll just drill it out. It's an awesome vise. Love it. Never even knew those things existed, and I watched a video that Mr. Pete did, Tublicane. He's a YouTuber if you're not familiar. He actually shows how to fabricate one of these float lock drill press vices. But I love them. And now I'm just using a deburring tool to deburr the holes that we drilled. And then we're doing a test fit. And everything looks good to go. So here we are with the switch assembly. And I am using a soldering iron to remove the 2 wires that are on that switch assembly. The solder that they used back in 1944 is some serious stuff. Took me a bit to get it where I could pull the wires out. And then just cleaning that hole out so that we don't run into an issue when we go back and solder a new wire onto this. I'm just marking the end of that wire where it came from. And we're removing the other wire as well. And that metal part got kind of hot, so I had to put on a glove. And marking that wire. So it's not necessary to remove the wires from that switch assembly. I'm going to be disassembling it. I would not recommend that you do that unless you know what you're doing, but I've taken enough of them apart. I know how to disassemble them and put them back together. So it's a very simple switch. Has a spring, brass screw that goes down through the center. It's kind of like more of a rod. And here we are over at my Craftsman grinder, and I'm just cleaning up the metal parts that are on the phonolytic board because we're not going to submerge that. So there's no way to derust it except with this is just a small brass wheel. So we go back to the motor parts and pulled them out of the citric acid after 24 hours, and we're just going to rinse them off. Cold water again. Yes, I've dropped screws down through the center drain there several times. You'd think I'd learn. And those are the end frames. So here we are back over at the bench, and I'm going to mix up some citric acid for those switch parts that we just disassembled. So the parts that aren't on the phonolytic board, we can submerge them in the citric acid. So the spring, that's stud, and the top piece. And we'll set that outside and let it go for 24 hours. Meanwhile, we are hand drying the parts that are going to get painted, and then all the other parts we dried with a towel, and now we're just coating them with some WD-40 to keep them from rusting. A lot of those parts will get cleaned up in the wire wheel, but for now we're just going to put some WD-40 on them. So over at the wire wheel, the parts that are going to get painted that still have paint on them. So this is the switch shield. And then the condenser shield or capacitor shield. If you do this, make sure you've got a good grasp on these parts, because that wire wheel will grab them and throw them. And we did the air cone and the terminal door as well. So now I'm using a piece of that 1/2 inch thick floor foam to make some plugs that are going to go in each one of those end frames where the bearing normally sits. And once I made the impression, I'm just going to trace it. And then I'm going to cut 4 of them out on the bandsaw. And there they are, just making sure they fit. They're a little bigger than they need to be, so that they make a nice tight fit. And then we're going to mask off the top part of that boss around where the bearing sits. You could probably paint it, but they don't come painted from the factory, so I don't paint them. So once we've got the masking on there, then we're going to stick those rubber plugs inside the bore for the bearing. And there will be 2, because that bore is a little deeper than a 1/2 inch, so you need to double them up. And they'll protrude from the opening a little, no big deal. And here we are, just applying the metal etching primer to all the parts. The air cone, the terminal door, the condenser shield, the base, and the 2 end frames. And my dog is supervising me. It was thundering outside, so he will not leave my side if it's thundering and lightning outside. Then we'll do the inside of the end frames or end bells. Then we're going to let those sit for about 15 minutes. Then we can change out that piece of wax paper that's on the 2x4 and then do the top side of the end frames. And while we're letting that sit for another 15 minutes or so, I've gone ahead and put the armature inside my metal lathe. And I'm going to wet sand both ends of the armature. So there are bearings, obviously, that sit on this, so we don't want to take a whole lot off. I'm using 600 grit. And I'll use 600, 800, and 1000 grit, and then I'll polish it. There's the 800. So if you do something like this, you got to be really careful because you've got blades and the bracket that holds the governor assembly in place that are towards the center of the armature, and they will take a finger if you let them. So I kind of just let the rubber piece of sanding block that I use get down in there and keep my fingers away from it. And of course we're rinsing and cleaning off the armature between each grit of sandpaper. So now we're just applying the mother's mag and aluminum polish, and then we're polishing it. And once both sides were done, then I'm coating it with the super lube, and then we'll wipe it down. And set it aside. So it's been about 15 minutes, so we're ready to start painting now. So I'm using that same champagne mist bronze or whatever it was that I used on the drill press on the motor as well. And we're going to paint these parts just like we primed them. So we'll paint the insides of the end frames, and then we'll paint all the parts that are hanging above it. Except we're going to wait a couple of hours before we flip those end frames. So I think I waited about 3 or 4 hours. Like I said, we wait a couple hours. And then we've got those end frames flipped, so we can paint the outside of them now. I don't even remember what caused me to turn around like that, but so once we finish painting, we're going to let these parts sit for about 24 to 48 hours before we even touch them. Now we're going to clean out the inside of the stator and clean the coils up. The lacquer on, or varnish on, these coils is in really good condition, especially for a motor being, as old as it is. So I'm just using a nylon brush. I'm not using, I've got a wire brush with me, but I didn't use it at all on this. And you just want to make sure you don't take any of that lacquer off. And that electrical contact cleaner that I'm using is really good stuff for that. So the parts that we had taken apart from the switch assembly, we were just pulling them out of the citric acid bath now that it's been 24 hours. We're going to rinse them, we're going to dry them, and we're going to coat them in the WD-40. And that's going to wrap up this video. So if this was helpful, please like and subscribe. I've got more to come, and I will see you next time.